Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. Outline the role of mediational processes in social learning theory, 2 marks. Here we have the command word outline, which means we need to give a detailed and thorough explanation. This question is focused on mediational processes as a key term within social learning theory, and so we want to give ideas and examples about mediational processes. These 2 marks are all AO1, so this is all about our knowledge. Let's have a look at an answer. Mediational processes are the bridge between a learning and cognitive approach, as they focus on how mental factors are involved in learning. When learning, an individual must retain an understanding of the behaviour in order to apply it to a different context. We've given a clear and detailed outline of this key term, understanding that it connects learning and cognitive approaches and is focused on the mental aspect of learning. It's clear here the implications of this in that we must understand and keep a memory of our learning in order to then apply it to other contexts. Briefly evaluate the cognitive approach, 4 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, so we need to give strengths and weaknesses of a particular theory or approach. In this case, we're focused on the cognitive approach and giving strengths and weaknesses of this. All 4 of our marks here are all evaluation marks, so we don't get any marks for explaining the nature of the cognitive approach. Let's have a look at our response. Cognitive psychologists emphasise the need to use scientific methods in their exploration of memory by focusing on the development of a standardised procedure that can be replicated. Laboratory experiments enable the control of extraneous variables so that cognitive psychologists can determine cause and effect relationships about the different nature of encoding between STM and LTM. In order for this to be evaluation, we need to have focused on why scientific methods are a strength, and we've done so by saying that they aid replication. We've also explained how laboratory experiments have high internal validity by controlling extraneous variables, and the consequence of this in terms of cause and effect relationships. It's important here we focused on cognitive psychology, and we've done so by making references to memory and short-term and long-term nature of encoding. We're then going to develop a second evaluation point. The cognitive approach is limited in its explanation of complex human experiences that have not been created in computers, such as emotions, that limits its validity. It suggests that people are mechanistic and lack free will, therefore this approach is very deterministic. We focused on the lack of validity or accuracy as a limitation of the cognitive approach. We've also explained that by focusing on this, it's suggesting that people lack free will and choice in their behaviours. Explain what is meant by the term congruence, 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which means we need a thorough and detailed account of this particular key term. This key term is focused on congruence, which is from the humanistic approach. Both of our 2 marks are explanation marks, and so we don't get any marks for explaining anything other than congruence in terms of humanistic psychology. Let's break down an answer. Congruence is when there is a similarity between a person's ideal self and how they view themselves in real life. The closer our self-image and ideal self, the greater the congruence. We've clearly shown an understanding of congruence in terms of our ideal self and our real self. We've said the impact of this in that the closer these are together, the greater our congruence. Outline the biological approach. Compare the biological approach with humanism, 16 marks. We've got 2 different command words here. The first one is outline. This is asking us to give a detailed description of a particular theory or approach. The focus for our explanation or outline is the biological approach, and we have 6 marks of our AO1 in order to explain and give detailed understanding of this particular approach to behaviour. We then need to compare this with a different approach, and in this case we're focusing on humanism. Where we're giving strengths and weaknesses, similarities and differences, this is going to be our AO3, and there are 10 marks available for this. Given the balance of marks, we need to have more comparison than we do explanation. We're going to start by explaining an aspect of the biological approach. The biological approach assumes that human behaviour is explained by physical differences. The approach investigates how biological structures and processes within the body impact on behaviour. Differences in specific regions of the brain would have a direct effect on different behaviours. Damage to the prefrontal cortex affects the ability to control one's impulses and explains aggressive behaviour. In our explanation, we've clearly talked about basic assumptions of this approach, in terms of physical differences and biological structures. We've then gone on to explain brain structures as a particular aspect of the biological approach. It's now time to move into our evaluation. Biological psychologists emphasise the need to use scientific methods in their exploration of behaviour, focusing on the development of standardised procedures that can be replicated. Here we're focusing on psychology as a science in order to make our comparison. We've identified that biological psychologists like to be able to replicate their studies. We're then going to explain this with some specific examples. Laboratory experiments have enabled the control of extraneous variables. We're then going to explain this in relation to specific methods that biological psychologists have used. Laboratory experiments enable the control of extraneous variables so that biological psychologists can determine cause and effect relationships about the role of different regions of the brain in different behaviours. Brain scanning techniques such as fMRI and EEG have improved our ability to examine activity within the brain whilst performing specific tasks, showing that the live brain in action and producing objective data that can be replicated. We've identified a range of research methods that biological psychologists use in order to show our understanding of their scientific investigation. It's now time to compare this with humanism. However, the humanistic approach rejects the use of scientific methods that have been used within science when examining human behaviour, as they do not allow the complexities of human behaviour to be accurately studied. As a consequence, justification for the use of humanistic counselling becomes difficult to justify, as only personal growth can be measured, and do not establish a causal relationship between counselling and improvement in mental health. We've clearly identified a counter-argument in that humanistic psychology rejects scientific methods. We've then said why this is a problem for this particular approach in terms of justifying a link between counselling and improved mental health. To complete our paragraph, we're going to come to a conclusion. Therefore, the biological approach is more objective than the humanistic approach, with a focus on higher levels of control within an exploration of human behaviour. We've clearly identified that because of the nature of the methods used, that biological approach is more objective. Let's go back to outlining the biological approach. Genes affect our behaviour and influence individual psychological differences between people. Biological psychologists study whether behavioural characteristics such as intelligence, personality, mental disorders are inherited in the same way as physical characteristics such as height and eye colour. Heritability demonstrates the extent to which behaviours are explained by genetic differences within the population. We've identified genetics as a different theory within the biological approach, explaining how they might explain different characteristics. We've also explained heritability as another key term within this approach. Now it's time to evaluate. The focus on physical differences create biological reductionism, where all behaviour is explained through variations in physiological structures and processes. We're now using reductionism and holism in order to compare our approaches. Biological reductionism is a key problem with the biological approach. Let's explain this further with some key evidence. Twin studies are used to compare the concordance rates of monozygotic twins to the concordance rates of dizygotic twins to establish if a trait or characteristic is due to biological factors. Joseph found a concordance rate of 40.4 for MZ and 7.4 for DZ twins, supporting that schizophrenia has a genetic explanation. However, twin studies are problematic and may overestimate genetic influences. Monozygotic twins are treated more similarly than dizygotic twins, and therefore higher levels of concordance may be the result of nurture rather than nature. A detailed explanation here has been given of different studies in order to explain genetics, focusing specifically on twin studies. We've also given an example of twin studies from our look at schizophrenia. However, you could use other twin studies here. More importantly, we've said why twin studies are problematic in that they overestimate genetic influences, as they fail to take into account that monozygotic twins often experience identity confusion and are treated more similarly. Let's compare this to humanism now. On the other hand, humanism is unique in its holistic approach to explaining human behaviour, that seeks to develop a holistic understanding of an individual and the extent to which different factors explain a given behaviour. Humanism also looks at the interaction between individuals within groups to acknowledge the contribution of the group and wider society to behaviour. We have a clear difference here, with humanism being holistic. We've explained why it's holistic and the impact of this on our understanding. Let's complete this paragraph with a judgment. Although biological psychology is more reductionist, it makes behaviour easier to quantify and test. However, the more holistic approach of humanistic approach is more valid when explaining complex human behaviours and the role within clinical conditions. We've identified a positive of reductionism, which will make us stand out in relation to other candidates. We've also said that by taking a holistic approach, humanism may be more accurate in explaining behaviours, especially those that are complex. Let's look at a different aspect of biological approach. Darwin would argue that genes are inherited to aid survival. As part of a biological approach, evolutionary explanations suggest that human behaviours are based on natural selection and ensure the survival of the fittest. Sexual selection suggests that certain traits are adopted in order to increase the likelihood of being selected by the opposite sex. Men have a preference for younger women with higher hip-to-waist ratios, whereas women have a preference for older men who have financial security. A range of ideas are presented here, firstly by starting with evolutionary explanations as part of a biological approach. Both natural selection and sexual selection are adequately explained here. Let's evaluate now. Exploration of universal behaviours by the biological approach are a consequence of the nature approach being taken to explain behaviours. We're now using the nature-nurture debate in order to compare our different approaches. We're going to give a detailed explanation of this in relation to the biological approach. Bowlby's evolutionary theory of attachment suggests that babies have developed social releases to ensure that caregivers are attached to. Physical social releases of babies, being cute, ensure their survival. Research from Buss supports the evolutionary approach and found that men across different cultures place a high value on physical attractiveness as an indicator for female fertility. We've given some different examples of research that focus on evolutionary theories. We've used Bowlby from attachment and Buss from relationships. Different examples could be used depending on the components that you study. We're then going to compare this to humanism. However, humanism acknowledges the role of nature, as the drive to self-actualize is innate, but also the role of environment and parents on shaping our ideal self and the positive impact on an individual of a parent's unconditional positive regard. We've given clear examples about how humanism looks at nature with innate ideas and nurture in terms of environment. We've used a range of key terminology to show a detailed understanding of humanism. Now let's come to a judgment. The biological approach focuses more on nature, as this explanation for human behaviour, it limits its ability to explain variations in human behaviour despite similar mechanisms. We're talking here about the problem with just focusing on nature in order to explain a variety of human behaviours. Let's go back to our explanation of the biological approach. Neurotransmitters may explain differences in human behaviour. Synaptic transmission is the process of turning an electrical signal into a chemical signal and then back to an electrical signal in the brain. An action potential travels down the axon and reaches the presynaptic neuron, triggering the vesicles to release neurotransmitters into the synapse. Neurotransmitters travel across the synapse and bind to receptor sites on the postsynaptic neuron. There are different receptors for different neurotransmitters that work like a lock and key. We've looked at a different aspect of the biological approach in terms of neurotransmitters, giving a detailed explanation of the role of synaptic transmission. Now let's evaluate once again. Biological theories have validity because of their real-world application. The approach has led to the development of useful ways of understanding and treating psychological disorders. The ability to apply approaches to the real world and help people with different conditions shows that the approaches are an accurate way or a valid way of explaining behaviour. Let's explain this with reference to a biological therapy. The biological approach has developed chemotherapies to help treat OCD. Antidepressants typically work by increasing the availability of the neurotransmitter serotonin by binding to the reuptake channels on the presynaptic receptor. As serotonin remains in the synapse, it's more likely to bind to the postsynaptic receptors. These drugs are effective in reducing the symptoms of OCD and provide support for a neural explanation of OCD. Sumru et al. Conducted a meta-review of SSRIs and found them to be more effective than placebos in treating OCD up to 3 months after treatment. We've clearly explained a biological therapy, focusing on drug therapies or chemotherapies. The use of antidepressants and how they work show our understanding of the application of this to the real world. We've also given supporting research to show that these are effective. We're now going to compare this to humanism and their approach to treatments. Furthermore, the assumptions within humanism have had a significant effect on counselling psychology, as Rogers claims that psychological problems are the result of conditions of worth. He encourages that counsellors act as facilitators for individuals, negotiating their own problems rather than being directive and imposing their power. Counselling psychology is a clear development within humanism and has been significant in terms of changing how psychologists have approached this, looking at the role of unconditional positive regard and psychologists as facilitators of our own therapy. It's time to come to a final judgment now. Both approaches offer a significant contribution to society in supporting clinical treatment, giving credibility to both biological and humanistic work. Where we're talking about credibility, we're talking about validity, that these are applicable to real life. Let's come to some concluding final remarks. The biological approach is significantly more scientific compared to humanism, focusing on a methodology that promotes control. Biological reductionism has limited the ability of the biological approach to explain different variations in behaviour. Humanism is a valid explanation of human behaviour, as both nature and nurture are explored. And finally, the ability to develop therapies that treat individuals using both biological and humanistic approaches show their external validity. Explain the role of the peripheral nervous system. 3 marks. The command word for this question is explain, which means we need a detailed description of the peripheral nervous system. All of these marks are about our knowledge of this particular part of the nervous system, and therefore we want 3 separate points for the 3 marks available. Let's have a look at an answer. The peripheral nervous system refers to all the nerves outside of the central nervous system. It relays nerve impulses from the CNS to the body and from the body to the CNS. We have a clear description here that these are all the nerves outside of the nervous system and the role of this, that they take impulses from the nervous system to the body and vice versa. And then we move on. Within the peripheral nervous system is the semantic nervous system. 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves make up the semantic nervous system. It is responsible for reflex actions that do not involve the central nervous system, allowing reflexes to occur very quickly. We've given another detailed description of what makes up the peripheral nervous system, giving details about the somatic nervous system. And then, another division of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, that enables voluntary actions to be performed as well as actions that do not require conscious awareness, like your heart beating. We've clearly explained a different component of the peripheral nervous system, this time focusing on the autonomic nervous system. Explain differences between sensory and relay neurons, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed description. The focus for this question is on differences, and so we need connectives that show the differences between these 2 different types of neurons. It's really important that we have these connectives rather than just juxtaposing or making 2 statements about these 2 different types of neurons. Let's have a look at an answer. Sensory neurons carry inputs from sensory receptors, whereas relay neurons allow sensory and motor neurons to communicate. Sensory neurons are found in various locations in the body, but relay neurons are only found in the brain. The thing that ensures that we get both 2 marks in this question is our use of connectives, directly comparing sensory neurons in terms of how they communicate and their location within the body. Researchers want to investigate the different stages of sleep, including REM, rapid eye movement, and non-REM sleep. Explain how the researchers could use an electroencephalogram, or EEG, to conduct their study, 3 marks. We've got the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed description of what we're doing. We also have a how in the question. This means we need to imagine that we are the researchers and be specific in terms of how we are going to conduct this particular piece of research. Because we have a STEM attached to this question, all of our marks become AO2 marks or application marks. And so our description of how we're using an EEG needs to be specific to that particular study. In this case, the use of different stages of sleep and investigating REM and non-REM sleep. Now it's time to break down an answer. The researchers could attach electrodes to the participant's scalp overnight and identify different brain waves. Beta waves would show that they are alert and awake, whereas theta waves show light sleep and delta waves show deep sleep. The researchers could identify which stage of sleep the participant is in based on their brain waves. By identifying that this would need to be overnight, we show a bit of understanding that this is about sleep. However, it moves more into showing the different waves and what stages of sleep that we are in that shows our knowledge and application to the STEM. The researchers could have a control group of people with normal sleep and compare these to individuals with different sleep disorders, such as insomnia or narcolepsy, based on their EEGs. We've clearly understood here that we might want a control group to make a comparison in order to establish cause and effect. We've also listed some specific sleep disorders that might show different brain activities based on their EEGs. Discuss the localisation of function in the brain, 8 marks. Here we have the command word discuss, which actually means we need to do 2 different skills. Firstly, we need to explain the localisation of function and understand what we mean by localisation as a psychological term. There are 3 marks available for our AO1, or our knowledge of localisation, that different regions of the brain have different functions. Our remaining 5 marks are all about evaluation, so research that supports or contradicts this idea of localisation of function. Let's have a look at an answer. Localisation of function is the idea that specific functions have specific locations in the brain. The motor centre controls voluntary movements in the opposite side of the body, with the left hemisphere controlling the right side of the body and the right hemisphere controlling the left side. The motor cortex is located in front of the precentral gyrus, with different parts of the cortex controlling different parts of the body. We've given a quick definition of localisation in order to access some of our AO1 marks, and then we've explained some specific details of the motor centre, giving details of how it works, and also showing our technical terminology here. Now it's time to evaluate. There is a wealth of case studies on patients with damage to Broca's and Wernicke's areas that demonstrates their functions. We've identified case studies as a particular research method in order to identify or examine localisation of function. Here we've talked about some other areas of the brain that have specific functions. We then need to explain this in some detail. Here we're going to explain Broca's area, which is mostly found in the left hemisphere and is responsible for speech production. If this area is damaged, patients will struggle to speak fluently. This region of the brain was first identified by Broca in a brain-damaged patient, Tan, who was able to understand spoken language and express his thoughts in writing, but not able to speak. In order to give our evaluation, we have also included some explanation of Broca's area and what it means. We've explained a specific case study and the findings from our patient, Tan. We're then going to develop this, showing logical chains of reasoning by giving a counter-argument. However, Dronkers et al. Conducted an MRI scan on Tan's brain to try and confirm Broca's findings. Although there was a lesion found in Broca's area, they also found evidence to suggest other areas may have contributed to the failure in speech production. The development of contradictory research with specific findings shows a good counter-argument. To complete our discussion, we want to form a judgment. The lack of external reliability suggests that Broca's area may not be the only region responsible for speech production, and the deficits found in patients with Broca's aphasia could be the result of damage to other neighbouring regions. We've clearly understood a key term in psychology in terms of external reliability, suggesting that different pieces of research have come to different findings. We're then going to return to our AO1. The somatosensory centre processes information from the skin. It is located in the parietal lobe after the central gyrus, producing sensations of touch, pressure, pain and temperature. Both hemispheres have a somatosensory cortex, with each receiving information from the opposite side of the body. We've given a clear explanation of the role of the somatosensory region of the brain in terms of what it is there to do, but also in terms of its location. Let's go back to evaluation once again. Some psychologists argue that the idea of localisation fails to take into account individual differences. Here we're using our key terminology in terms of individual differences. We want to be a little bit careful here because we are saying that the results are different because people are different, which needs a little bit of explanation in order to access those great AO3 marks. To explain this, we want to focus on a specific individual difference. Harazzi found that women have proportionately larger Broca's and Wernicke's areas than men, which can perhaps explain the greater ease of language use amongst women, suggesting that localisation has beta bias, with differences between men and women being ignored. Variations in the pattern of activation and the size of areas observed during the various language activities are not considered. We've used research to explain a key individual difference in terms of gender, and we've also used our wider knowledge from issues and debates to talk about the impact of this in terms of beta bias. We've been specific in terms of what has not been considered and therefore which might have an impact on localisation. It's time to give a counter-argument now in terms of a strength of localisation of function and the methods we have used. However, case studies have been utilised to explore localisation ethically, as psychologists can take advantage of brain injuries that have naturally occurred to examine the impact on behaviour. Patients are often studied longitudinally to see if deficits reduce through functional recovery or whether they are permanent. We've given both a benefit of case studies and explained the impact of this particular research method on localisation of function. It's time to give a mini judgment once again in terms of our discussion. The validity of localisation of function is problematic, as the impact of regional variations have not been explored by psychologists. Here we've said that there's a problem with the accuracy of the information, and to say that localisation of function is true for everyone. Let's return to AO1 for our final AO1 mark. The auditory centre processes speech-based information and is located in the temporal lobe on both sides of the brain. Decoding takes place within the brain stem, and the thalamus acts as a relay station carrying out further processing of auditory information. Here we focused on auditory centres, giving both their location and their purpose. We've talked about how other regions of the brain interact in order to show different functions in the same process. It's time to go back to evaluation. Given the allocation of marks, we want more evaluation than explanation within our response. The claim that functions are localised to certain areas of the brain has been criticised. Here we need to explain some opposing research in order to develop this statement. We're going to explore this with a different way of looking at brain function. Lashley proposed the equipotentiality theory, which suggests that the basic motor and sensory functions are localised, but higher mental functions are not. When areas of the cortex were removed in rats, no area was proven to be more important than any other in their ability to learn a maze, suggesting that learning requires every part of the brain rather than being confined to just one. We've clearly given a different theory here in terms of equipotentiality theory, using Lashley's research and the findings in terms of learning the maze in order to support this. Let's show off our knowledge by developing this discussion. Furthermore, plasticity shows that when the brain becomes damaged and a particular function has been lost, the brain is able to reorganise itself in an attempt to recover and take over responsibilities for specific cognitive functions following brain injury. We've used neural plasticity and functional recovery here to show a wider understanding of localisation of function, and we can use different areas of biopsychology in order to help support these different counter-arguments. Let's give a conclusion to our piece of discussion. Therefore, localisation of function is a reductionist way to explain how the brain works. Here we're using our wider psychological knowledge and showing that we understand how specialist terminology should be used. To complete our response, we're going to come to a mini conclusion. There is empirical support for the role of specific regions of the brain with specific behaviours or abilities. Here, where we're using the word empirical, we're saying that there's evidence to support localisation. Individual differences in behaviour are not adequately explained by localisation, suggesting that assumptions about the male brain have been generalised to all brain functionality. And finally, localisation is reductionist, as functional recovery and plasticity suggest that the brain can adapt and functions can return after an injury. Discuss the fight or flight response, 8 marks. Here we have the command word discuss. This is asking us to do 2 separate skills. Firstly, we're being asked to outline. There are 3 marks available for our outline of the fight or flight response. We're also being asked in our discuss question to evaluate, giving strengths and weaknesses of the fight or flight response. We've got 5 marks available for that, so we need more evaluation than explanation. There are 2 different response systems to stress. The response to sudden stressors triggers the sympathetic nervous system, preparing the body for rapid action. The SNS signals the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline. The hormone adrenaline circulates the body, making the heartbeat faster and pushing blood to the muscles, heart and lungs. When the threat has passed, the parasympathetic nervous system reduces the stress response, slows the heart rate and reduces blood pressure. When we're talking about sudden stressors, we want to think about Sam runs fast, that the sympathetic nervous system is activating or signalling the adrenal medulla in order to release adrenaline. We want to explain how adrenaline has an impact on the body. We've also talked about a return to homeostasis by explaining the role of the parasympathetic nervous system as well. So we've explained for our first part of our discuss command word, and now we're going to move into evaluation. The measurement of hormones can be objectively tested using blood samples, enabling a scientific investigation of stress. Here we've talked about objectivity, and that by doing so we are removing personal bias. We've also indicated our wider psychological knowledge, understanding that this is a feature of science. We're going to explain a counter-argument next in order to show logical chains of reasoning. However, these are often baseline measurements, rather than the hormone levels associated with sudden stressors that are more likely to elicit a fight or flight response. When we're looking at blood samples, we're talking about a baseline measurement, or where we are normally. We're not going to be in the middle of a stressful situation taking a blood sample, and therefore this has an issue for our understanding of the fight or flight response. To counter this, we're going to explain how else we could study the fight or flight response, or stressors. To be ethical, research relies on self-report questionnaires asking about stressful events in the form of life change units, which is problematic because of social desirability bias, as people tend to underreport the effect of stress. We've shown our understanding of how questionnaires are used, and we've given a bit more detail in terms of life change units. You wouldn't necessarily need to include this, especially if you haven't done stress as one of your options. However, what is important is we've said the impact of using questionnaires. Social desirability bias is saying what is normal or what we perceive to be normal, and therefore we've reduced the validity and underreported the effects of stress. We're going to link this all together, giving a judgment next. The lack of validity in measuring stress is problematic in creating causal explanations for fight or flight responses. So we've discussed our lack of accuracy in terms of cause and effect. We're then going to discuss our other response to stressors. The response to chronic stressors is called the HPA axis. If the brain continues to perceive stress, the hypothalamus releases CRH into the bloodstream. Once the CRH reaches the pituitary gland, it produces and releases ACTH, which travels in the bloodstream to the adrenal glands. We've got key terminology here in order to explore and explain the HPA axis. Talking about CRH, and you can learn the full name or you can use this abbreviation, and we're linking that to ACTH produced by the adrenal glands. And then we're going to give a bit more evaluation to the fight or flight response. Fight or flight takes a reductionist view to stress. We've used key terminology here, saying that it's a simplified viewpoint. And then we're going to explain why it's too simplistic. Individuals who experience sudden stress may freeze instead of having a fight or flight response. Individuals who grow up in a stressful environment have larger amygdala volumes and show an even greater response to stress. They may fib, flop, faint, or even flap. We've given a clear explanation of why it's reductionist, talking about a freeze response and a range of responses that we might have to a stressor. And then we're going to elaborate. Moreover, freezing may be an adaptive response that focuses the attention of the individual under stress and allows them to look for additional information to respond to the threat. Our elaboration here is a continuation of our discussion, talking about why the freeze response may be beneficial. By talking about it being an adaptive response, we're linking this back into our threat survival and evolutionary explanations. We've explained why it might be adaptive and help survival. We're then going to form a mini judgment once again. Although the physical response to stress is the same, these explanations are not enough to account for the range of human behaviours shown in the stress response systems. So again, we're going back and explaining that this is not valid, it's not accurate, because it's too simplistic. We're going to do a final piece of explanation once again, just to secure and bolt on that third mark. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex, down by the kidneys, to release cortisol, which gives a quick burst of energy and lowers sensitivity to pain. However, this lowers the immune system, which may result in illness for people who have chronic stress. It's really important that we identify that it's the adrenal cortex involved in the HPA axis. We've clearly explained the response to this within the body, showing our biopsychological knowledge. Let's evaluate once again. Fight or flight responses to stress show beta gender bias as they underestimate gender differences. We're using key terminology here in order to show our wider psychological knowledge. We're then going to explain this further by using psychological research. Taylor et al. Found that women tend and befriend rather than showing the fight or flight. This involves protecting themselves and their children through nurturing, tending, and forming protective alliances with other women, befriending. We've clearly explained this research, giving specific details, focusing on how women are different. We're going to explore this further by giving an additional piece of research showing gender differences. Furthermore, Lee and Harley found that gender differences were the result of genetic variants, with males having the SRY gene on their Y chromosome, which promotes aggression as a response to stress, as well as releasing adrenaline to increase blood flow to the organs. In females, the absence of the gene and the action of estrogen and oxytocin prevent fight or flight responses to stress. Here we've talked about a genetic variant having an interaction within our stress responses, showing a difference with males having the gene and females not. We've linked this into specific other hormones that would be important in explaining these gender differences. And then we're going to give a final judgment. Gender differences in fight or flight responses have external reliability. By stating that they have external reliability, we're saying there's a consistent research picture that says that gender has an impact on the fight or flight response. We're going to come to some final conclusions in order to complete our essay. The lack of validity in the methodology to examine stress responses limit explanations for fight or flight response. Variations in the responses to stress show that exploring just fight or flight responses is reductionist. Gender differences in responses to stress suggest that biopsychology alone cannot explain response to sudden stressors. Olive is having problems getting to sleep at night. She believes that exposure to blue light from her phone before she goes to bed might have an influence on how long it takes her to get to sleep and the quality of sleep that she gets. Olive records the quality of her sleep using a Likert scale, of 1 being poor sleep and 7 being high quality sleep, for a week, and decides to use a specialised blue light for 10 minutes before going to sleep. State an operationalised directional hypothesis for Olive's study, 2 marks. Here we have the command word state, which means you need a couple of sentences on this. This is clear and directed. We've got some key terminology here that we need to be familiar with in order to show off our psychological knowledge. The first is operationalised. This is how we're going to measure each of our variables. We need both conditions on an IV and the outcome for the DV, particularly if there is a discrete unit of measurement or score. The other mark comes from our hypothesis being directional. We need to specifically state a directional outcome in order to meet this requirement. Let's have a look at our hypothesis. Exposure to a blue light before going to sleep will have a lower sleep satisfaction score out of 7 than not being exposed to a blue light before going to sleep. We get our first mark for being directional in saying that there will be a lower score. We get our second mark for giving both outcomes for the IV, exposure to a blue light or not being exposed to the blue light, as well as the sleep satisfaction score out of 7, and we must say out of 7. Explain how Olive could improve the validity of her study, 2 marks. Let's break down our question. Firstly, we've got the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed, thorough description. We've also got in this question how and an improvement. So we know with how, we need to put ourselves in the position of the researcher, and for improvement, we've got to say what specifically we're going to improve, how we're actually going to do that with some specific details, and then why that is an improvement. In addition to that, the focus of this question is validity, which means we need to improve the accuracy of this study, or how the researcher has measured what they intended to measure, or improving that measurement strategy. We get 1 mark for our improvement in context, our what and our how, and a further mark of justifying why that improves validity. Let's have a look at answer. Olive could ensure that she has her room at the same temperature by setting the thermostat at 16 degrees C, as if the room is hotter one night, then it may reduce the quality of the sleep that she had during the night rather than the blue light affecting her sleep. So we've got what we're going to improve, the temperature of the room. We've got how we're going to improve it, setting the thermostat at 16 degrees. And then we're justifying why this is improving validity, because if it's hotter one night, she might reduce the quality of her sleep, and therefore it's not a causal relationship for the blue light. Here we've got some data. Table 1 shows us the mean and standard deviation for the effect of blue light on sleep. Blue light has a mean of 2.7 and a standard deviation of 1.43. The control group has a mean of 3.5 and a standard deviation of 0.9. Explain 2 conclusions about the effect of blue light on sleep, 4 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed description. We also have some key psychological terminology here in terms of conclusions. We get 1 mark for identifying each of our conclusions, and we get a 2nd mark for justifying that conclusion using data from Table 1. Let's have a look at an answer. The mean of 3.5 in the control condition suggests that the quality of sleep that Olive has without the blue light is better than when she does have the blue light, as a lower score suggests poorer sleep. We've identified our conclusion here that sleeping without the blue light is better for the quality of sleep that Olive gets. We've justified that by saying that the mean score for the control group is higher. And then we need to move on to our 2nd conclusion. The standard deviation of the blue light condition is more spread out than the control condition, as there is a difference of 0.53. So the improvement in the quality of her sleep without the blue light is more consistent. Again, we've identified a specific conclusion that the quality of her sleep without the blue light is more consistent. We've justified that with data by looking at the difference between the 2 standard deviations. We've also identified that with the blue light, it is more spread out. You can just lift the data from the table and do not need to manipulate it as we have done with the 2nd conclusion that we've given. Be careful if you are adding, subtracting, manipulating the data in any way that you are accurate in how you have done this. Olive decides to use the mean as her measure of central tendency. Briefly evaluate the use of the mean, 2 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, but it is only brief and it's 2 marks. This means we only need to focus on strengths and weaknesses. Be aware that in some questions they might just use the phrase measure of central tendency rather than specifying mean, median or mode, so you need to have a connection between these 2 things. You get 1 mark for identifying a strength or weakness and a 2nd mark for justifying why that is a strength or weakness. As we have a STEM question here, we will need to have that weakness or strength in the context of Olive's study, all about sleep. Let's have a look at an answer. The mean is affected by extreme scores, which may skew the data, so one very poor night's sleep may give the picture that Olive's sleep generally isn't good, making the mean unrepresentative of her sleep for the week. We've clearly identified a weakness in that the mean is affected by extreme scores. However, we need the context of how this would have an impact. So one very poor night's sleep is where we actually get our identification mark. We then justify this by saying that the mean is then unrepresentative of her sleep, affecting the validity and generalizability of these results if we wanted to do that extra additional step further. Explain what Olive should include in the discussion section of her scientific report, 3 marks. Here we've got the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed description of the discussion section. Now, this is a key term within psychology, and so we need to know what is included in the discussion section. Because this is a STEM-based question, we also need to have this all linked into Olive's study, and all of our marks are AO2 marks or application marks. Let's have a look at an answer. The discussion section includes the relationship between the findings and conclusions of her study on the impact of blue light on quality of sleep and previous research into exogenous zeitgebers and sleep. So we have an understanding of what is included in a discussion section with the relationship between previous research, and then we've linked this into Olive's particular study about blue light and exogenous zeitgebers or outside influences on sleep. Olive should include the strengths and weaknesses of her methodology, including how she selected the sample and whether using a Likert scale would give her information that she needed from the participants. Again, we've got the knowledge of a discussion section here, but this wouldn't necessarily give us marks unless we applied it to Olive's study. And we've done that here by talking about her Likert scale that she used. And finally, it should include what research Olive would do next to explore the role of blue light and sleep, such as whether using a blue light directly before going to sleep affected sleep quality compared to leaving it 10 minutes in darkness after using the blue light. So we have our final understanding of what should be included in a discussion section, so what to do next, the next area for research, and we have linked this into Olive's study by giving an example of what she might do next. Dr. Patel is a psychologist studying whether virtual reality, VR, can increase empathy towards people experiencing homelessness. She recruits 80 volunteers aged 18 to 25 from a university campus. Half of the participants wear a VR headset and experience a simulation showing a day in the life of a homeless person, including searching for shelter and interacting with passers-by. The other half watch a standard documentary about homelessness on a laptop. Afterward, all the participants complete a questionnaire measuring empathy levels and willingness to donate money to homelessness charities. Explain how Dr. Patel could implement an independent group's design. 2 marks. Here we've got the command word explain, which means we need a detailed description. We've also got how, which means we need to put ourselves in Dr. Patel's position and practically give steps about implementing. There's also some assumed psychological knowledge here in that we understand what independent groups or independent measures design is. There's 2 marks here, so we need 2 steps in the design, in implementation, and both of those need to be linked into the STEM and the focus of Dr. Patel's study. These are all application marks. Let's have a look at our answer. Dr. Patel could put all the volunteers from the university into a hat and randomly assign them to either the VR headset or the documentary condition. Dr. Patel could put the first name into the VR condition and the next into the documentary until she has 40 participants in each condition. We've got that all the participants are from a university, which would give us some application marks, and that they've been randomly assigned, that's part of an independent group's design, into either of the 2 conditions, and we've specified those. Just using the name Dr. Patel is not enough because that is in the question. We've then been clear that the first name is going to go into the VR condition and the next into the documentary, and we've talked about 40 participants in total. All of this is from our STEM. A psychologist is interested in the development of helping behaviours in children in preschool. They believe that children who are raised by parents who have pro-social professions, such as nursing, are more likely to be pro-social with their peers than children who are raised by parents who have competitive professions, such as a stockbroker. The psychologist collects information about the parent's profession through sending a questionnaire home to 10 local primary schools with a nursery. A series of closed questions are asked, including the critical question of the profession of each parent, which is then coded as pro-social, competitive, or neither. The psychologist then conducts a study with each child to determine whether they were helpful. A child of a similar age, but who wears a different uniform, walks past the child and then drops the books they were carrying on the floor. The psychologist then records whether the preschooler helped to pick up the books or not. Explain one way in which researcher bias could have influenced the validity of the pro-social behaviours study, 2 marks. In this question, we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed and extended response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge here in that we understand what researcher bias is. This is some way in which the researcher might be influenced towards a certain outcome. Our first mark comes from identification of a way in which they might be biased. Our second mark comes from justifying. This means we need to explain why the thing we have identified is going to affect the validity or the accuracy of this study. Let's have a look at a response. The researcher could be biased in which professions they classify as competitive based on their personal beliefs. The psychologist may believe that a doctor is pro-social, whereas a different psychologist may believe that it is a competitive field to get into, creating subjectivity. We've identified that classification is a way in which researchers might have bias. We've linked this into the STEM, giving context by identifying that the competitiveness of the profession might be the thing that is biased. We're going to tick this off in our STEM to show that we have given context and a range of ideas. We've justified that in terms of subjectivity, and the accuracy of this study is being challenged by the subjective interpretation of careers. We've developed our example of competitive nature and classification through the use of a doctor, of how it might be pro-social or competitive. Explain how the psychologist could use opportunity sampling in the helping behaviours study, 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which is asking us to give detail and extension within our discussion. It has some assumed psychological knowledge in that we understand what opportunity sampling is. And this question is focused on how we would conduct that sample. So we need to put ourselves in the position of the researcher and how specifically we would do that if we were them. There's 2 marks available for these questions, but this particular question is all about application, and so it has to link into the STEM and the scenario of helping behaviours study. Let's have a look at an answer. The psychologist could go to some preschools attached to a hospital and some in affluent areas in order to access parents with pro-social and professional jobs. The children that attended the preschool on the day that the psychologist attends would be participants in the study. We need 2 separate links to the STEM. So we've started by saying that we're going to access preschools attached to a hospital and in affluent areas. We've used information from our STEM here for our 2 different types of parents, having nurses with our pro-social behaviours and stockbrokers are more competitive. We understand that opportunity sampling is about whoever has attended on a given day, and we've put that into context by thinking about this as preschoolers, and so that shows that we've understood beyond what's in the question. We're going to highlight in here that we've got a nursery for our sample. Explain what is meant by a type 1 error, 1 mark. Our question has the command word explain, which means we need to give some detail and extension to our definition. We have some assumed psychological knowledge here in not only knowing about what errors are, but what a type 1 error is. This is a knowledge question, so our marks here are all AO1. Let's have a look at an answer. When the alternate hypothesis has been incorrectly accepted. Here we have a clear understanding of an error in that we've incorrectly done something. By incorrectly accepting the alternate hypothesis, we've said that something is happening in our study when it isn't. Identify the likelihood of a type 1 error at a level of significance of p equals less than or equal to 0.05, 1 mark. Here we have the command word identify, which is looking for a particular statement. This question has some assumed psychological knowledge in terms of what a type 1 error is. This is a false positive. It means that we have incorrectly accepted the alternate hypothesis in error and should have rejected it. But this question is looking for what type or what likelihood there is that we've made an error. And for this, we need to focus on our level of significance, which always tells us the likelihood of a type 1 error. We're converting this decimal into a ratio in order to talk about likelihood. The likelihood of a type 1 error is 1 in 20. So we've taken 5 in 100 and we've simplified that to 1 in 20. A research team are interested in whether belief in the paranormal was affected by culture. A self-selected sample of 10 participants was recruited from a university campus in the UK, Japan, America and Brazil. They were interviewed about what beliefs they held about the paranormal using a semi-structured interview. All the participants were asked about their beliefs on ghosts, faith healing and their beliefs on life after death. As part of the interview, the participants were also asked about any other beliefs that they held as an opportunity to gain new insights on paranormal beliefs that the research team might not be aware of. The research team collected quantitative data in the number of beliefs held about pre-existing paranormal beliefs. They also collected qualitative data, recording the responses that the participants gave to the open-ended question about any additional beliefs that the participants had. Explain one strength of collecting qualitative data in the paranormal belief study, 2 marks. This question has the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. The focus of this question is a strength, and so all of our marks need to come from describing a strength. The assumed knowledge in this question is that we understand what qualitative data is. There are 2 marks in this question, and we get 1 mark for identifying a particular strength of qualitative data. Because this is a STEM question, that strength needs to be linked into the paranormal belief study. Therefore, this becomes an AO2 mark. Our second mark is then to justify that, to say why that is a strength for this particular piece of research. Time to have a look at a response. By collecting qualitative data, the research team can access information about the meaning paranormal beliefs have for individuals, increasing the validity as the researchers understand what beliefs are held and why participants have them. We've identified our strength in that our qualitative data gets the meaning behind individual paranormal beliefs. We've justified that by saying that this increases the validity of the study and we understand what beliefs are held and why they are held. Explain how the research team could analyse their qualitative data, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this question in that we understand what qualitative data is. This is written data, and we can remember that by the L in qualitative. This question is focused on how we're going to analyse that data, or how we're going to break it down in order to draw some findings out and understand this piece of research. As this question has a STEM, we need 2 separate ways or 2 separate ideas for our 2 AO2 marks. Both need to be linked into the context of our STEM in order for us to gain lots of marks for this particular response. Let's have a look at our answer. The research team could create behavioural categories for the additional paranormal beliefs held by the participants. For example, being able to move objects or communicate with dead people. We've demonstrated our understanding of qualitative data analysis by talking about behavioural categories. We've then linked this into the STEM by giving particular paranormal beliefs that we'd be creating those behavioural categories about. We're going to tick this off in our STEM in order to show a variety of application skills. We need a second idea in order to get our second mark. The research team could tally the number of times that behavioural categories appear in the transcriptions of the participants' responses to the question about additional beliefs to compare them cross-culturally. We've understood that in qualitative data analysis, we need to tally up the times that a particular category appears. We've linked this back into the STEM, not only talking about the response to the open question, but the aim of this piece of research in order to study cross-cultural beliefs. We've returned back to the aim of the study in order to get our second application mark. A psychologist decides to investigate the impact of watching an opposite-sex role model play with gender-stereotypical toys on the selection of a gender-stereotypical toy by children in a controlled observation. The children watched a video of a role model playing with the toy and then were taken to an observation room to play for 10 minutes. A range of gender stereotypical toys for both genders were available in the observation room. The observer records the number of toys played with using time sampling. Table 1 shows the results from the observation of stereotypical toys played with. Along the top, what we have is the recording of time in minutes, so between minute 1 and to minute 2, minute 2 to 3, 3 to 4, etc. We've got two different sets of scores, one from observer 1 and one from observer 2 in our table. Draw a scattergraph to show these results, 3 marks. Here we have the command word draw, so we would need to sketch out or draw this particular graph. We have some assumed psychological knowledge here in that we understand what a scattergram or a scattergraph looks like. So within our response, what we'd want to do is draw out our 2 axes on our graph paper that's provided. We'd want to have an appropriate scale for each axis. So this is going to be from 1 to 10, and this one is going to be from 1 to 10 as well. Each time slot is going to be 1 point on our graph. So we're going to have observer 1 on this axis and observer 2 on this axis. Where they meet, that's where we're going to put our cross. We're going to do this for each of our time slots. We need to be consistent that observer 1 is always on one axis and observer 2 is always on the other. We then want to give our graph a title. A scattergraph or scattergram to show the relationship between observers of stereotypical toy play. Our final mark comes from giving both of our axes a title. Now we need to know what we're recording, so number of toys by observer 1 and number of toys by observer 2. The psychologist wants to test the reliability of the observers. Suggest an appropriate statistical test that could be used to do this, and explain 2 reasons for your choice in the context of the study, 5 marks. There are 2 different command words within this question. The first one is suggest. Within our suggestion, we need to identify an appropriate statistical test that we can use, and this is an AO1 mark. Our second command word is to explain, and we need to give detail and The second command word is explain, and we need to give detail and extension to our explanation. Because this needs to be in the context of our study, this becomes AO2 marks to explain why that's appropriate given this particular scenario. Whenever it comes to selecting statistical tests, you need a strategy to help you remember. We suggest that you use never chuck chocolate sponge in my red wellies spur. Sounds a bit bananas, but we're going to have a look at this and break it down, hopefully making it more simplistic and understanding what we're doing. The first thing we're looking to do is identify whether we have nominal data in our scenario. If we've got nominal data, then it's based on categories. Let's have a look at how our DV is measured. It's the number of toys being played with. So that's not a category, so we don't have nominal data. Therefore, we're not going to be doing a chi-square because we have not got nominal data, making it at least ordinal. It's then time to ask a few more questions. Our next question is whether our study is correlational or not. Here we're looking to test the reliability of our observers, or look at the relationship between observer 1 and observer 2. This means that our study is a correlation. So we can tick that it is a correlation. If it wasn't, we'd be looking at whether it's a test of difference and then whether we've got an independent or repeated measures design. We don't need to include that in the purpose of this particular question though. We have two different types of tests, and these are either based on parametric data or non-parametric data on the other side. So all of the ones here are non-parametric data. When we're looking at parametric data, we're talking about a normal distribution. If we go back and look at our STEM, there's no discussion about this being normally distributed or equally distributed in society. And therefore we're working on our non-parametric data side, which means that we would do a Spearman's row test. We've done quite a lot of work here for our first mark, that Spearman's row would be an appropriate statistical test. We'd then need to justify this using the information that we've already looked at in our table here. Let's break down our explanation. They should select this statistical test because they are testing a relationship between stereotypical toys recorded by the observers. By identifying that this is a correlation, we can talk about this being a test of relationship. We've put this into the context of our study by saying that we are looking at the observers who are recording the number of stereotypical toys. We're then going to give a second reason. The psychologist has ratio data as the number of stereotypical toys that the children played with is being recorded. We know that it's a Spearman's row because we've got at least ordinal data. We've been a bit more specific here and said that it's ratio data in that it has an absolute 0. We've put that into the context of our study by talking about the number of stereotypical toys. We use this to identify that this was not ratio data. Mr. Causa decides to set his English class a challenging poem. Farouk is struggling to understand the concept of alliteration. He notices that Eleonora confidently applies the concept using a silly song to remember what different poetry devices are. A psychologist decides to conduct an observation of Mr. Causa's class. Explain how the psychologist can ensure that their observation is scientific, 3 marks. We have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension in our discussion here. There is also some assumed psychological knowledge here in terms of features of science, and we would need to incorporate these into our response. Because there is a STEM here, we need all of our 3 marks to be application. We need to link this into the psychologist looking at Mr. Causa's class and the specific details within the information that we've been given. Let's have a look at a response. The psychologist could use a directional hypothesis in observing learning in English, as Bandura et al. Have already conducted research into the role of modelling and imitation in learning. Here we have a clear feature of science in terms of hypothesis testing. We've also linked this back into our STEM by talking about this being in the English lesson and an understanding of the previous research in observational learning with Bandura et al. We can tick this off in our STEM in terms of the English class, so we know that we've used different parts of the STEM within our application. We're then going to look at another feature of science. The psychologist should only conduct their observation with Mr. Causa and this class to control prior beliefs of ability being an extraneous variable. We've shown another feature of science here by talking about high levels of control. We've shown control and linked this into the STEM in terms of beliefs about ability, because here we're trying to understand a concept and that might have an impact on our conclusions. For our 3rd mark, we're going to link in a 3rd feature of science. The psychologist could create an observation schedule of expected classroom behaviours to aid replication. We've identified replication as an additional feature of science. We've linked this into the STEM in terms of expected classroom behaviours, and we can tick this off in our STEM as well. Gareth is interested in how people behave in cooperative virtual environments. He studies players using a popular virtual reality game where participants must work together to solve puzzles and one where they do not. Design an observation that could be conducted to study cooperative virtual environments. In your answer, you should provide details of the aim and hypothesis of the study, the selection of the participants, the type of observation and the implementation of an observation schedule, ethical issues and resolutions, justify your design choices, 12 marks. Here we have the command word design, which means you need to think that you are the person conducting this observation, you are Gareth, and what are you going to do? Use the bullet points in order to structure your answer and tick these off to make sure that you've done each and every part. The context of this is your cooperative virtual environments, and so each of your design decisions need to be linked into this. There are 6 AO2 marks available for all of these design decisions. The more specific you can be, the better. A further 6 marks justifies why you have made these choices. What are the benefits or limitations of making the choices that you have made? Let's start with our first bullet point in terms of the aim and hypothesis. There is some assumed psychological knowledge here in that you understand the difference. So the aim is the general purpose of the research or the research question, with the hypotheses being specific predictions for this study. Let's have a look at an answer. The aim of the experiment is to investigate the level of cooperation in virtual environments. The alternate hypothesis is participants in the virtual environment where they have to work together will use more supportive language on in-game communications than those in first-person shooter games. The null hypothesis is there will be no difference in the amount of supportive language used on in-game communications between the virtual environment where they have to work together and the first-person shooter game. We've clearly identified the general purpose of this study in terms of looking at the level of cooperation in virtual environments. Each study will need to have an alternate hypothesis and a null hypothesis. The alternate hypothesis could be directional or non-directional. In this case, we've gone for a directional hypothesis, and we've clearly identified that there would be more cooperation in one condition. We've made sure to outline both conditions in terms of the virtual environment where they have to work together and the first-person shooter game. We've also identified the DV on how we're going to measure that in terms of the amount of supportive language being used. The key thing with the null hypothesis is we've stated there will be no difference. Again, we've got both conditions and how this is going to be measured. Now it's time to justify. A directional hypothesis can be used to conduct the experiment as there has been previous research into the change in behaviour in virtual reality environments. A null hypothesis is used as a control within the study. The design of the research should be to support the null so extraneous variables are controlled. We've justified our decision to use a directional hypothesis by saying that there is previous research. We've also justified why it's necessary to use the null hypothesis and the impact of this on our study. We can tick this bullet point off in our plan. Next, it's time to look at the selection of participants, how we're going to have those people in our study. Gareth could use an opportunity sampling technique and use participants who are playing the puzzle solving and first-person shooter game at the time of the study. Gareth could host both games online with an explanation that participants are going to be recorded whilst they play the game to assess how quickly they adapt to the game rather than their level of cooperation. We've identified that we are using opportunity sampling as a specific sampling technique. We've then said how we're going to do that in terms of just joining in the hosting of the 2 different games. We said that he could do this online, and we've also said how we're going to deceive participants. In this case, not that they're being observed, but the nature of the observation being conducted. It's now time to justify this selection. Using opportunity sampling is convenient for Gareth, as he would just need to host the online games and then the first participants to enter each game would become his participants in the study. However, Gareth needs to be aware that how and what platforms he hosts both games may impact the sample accessed and impact the level of cooperation. We've identified both strengths of using opportunity sample and weaknesses. We've also said the impact of this on the particular nature of his study, showing more application skills. We've covered both the selection of the participants in terms of the sampling technique and justified the use of opportunity sampling. It's now time to identify the type of observation that we're going to use. And there is a direction here to include an observation schedule. This is merely how we're going to structure the observation in terms of maybe time or event sampling. what we're going to record and how we're going to record it. Gareth should select to do a non-participant observation so that he can observe the level of cooperation within the virtual environments and ensure that he does not miss any examples of cooperative behaviour among the participants. Gareth could structure his observation schedule using time sampling, breaking down each 30 seconds of the gameplay to ensure that he is fully concentrating and accurately recording their cooperative behaviours. He would tally each time participants take Overwatch or healer roles, the selection of cooperation mode to complete puzzles together, or explanations over microphones of next steps or sources of danger. We've clearly identified a specific type of observation, and it doesn't really matter what type you're doing as long as you put it into context and justify it. We've also identified time sampling as a particular way in which we could construct the observation schedule. We've clearly stated how this will be implemented in terms of every 30 seconds and different things that he could tally in terms of the behaviours. You could physically draw an observation schedule here and list out those behaviours and write a time slot, absolutely fine, and would still meet the criteria. Let's justify these design choices now. By conducting a non-participant observation, Gareth is less likely to miss key details in his observation of cooperative behaviour, as he's not having to play the online game at the same time. Gareth's use of an observation schedule increases the objectivity of his study, as preset behavioural categories of cooperative and non-cooperative behaviours can be established. We've justified both elements in terms of non-participant observation and increasing objectivity by using a schedule. We've clearly categorised this in relation to the STEM in terms of talking about non-cooperative and cooperative behaviours. Again, we're going to go back up to our bullet points and we can tick this off as part of our criteria. It's now time to look at ethical issues and resolutions. So we both need to identify what might be a problem and how we're going to solve them. Gareth could get informed consent by explaining the nature of the game and that participants' playing transcripts would be recorded when they sign up to play the game. The participants could also give retrospective consent after reviewing the transcripts of their play and sign a consent form to take part in the study. Gareth could follow up with participants to ensure that if negative comments were said, that the participants that they were said to weren't harmed or upset by them. We've shown psychological knowledge here by using key terms. This is going to ensure that the exam board knows what we're talking about and that we understand the nature of ethical issues. We've linked this into the nature of our study by clearly talking about transcripts of the gameplay and if negative comments were said, so that people are giving consent and followed up to protect them from harm. It's now time to justify these choices. Ensuring that the study meets ethical guidelines ensures that the reputation of psychology is upheld and that the participants are supported by clinicians, ensuring continued participation in psychological research. Given that Gareth's research is online, he needs to ensure that the anonymity of participants is upheld after the research has been published. We've given a couple of different reasons why it's important to be ethical in our research. We've also identified that anonymity might be an issue, and we've specified this to being online in order to take into the context of his research. We go back up to the question once again to tick this off. We've used those bullet points to clearly structure each paragraph, showing that we've done exactly what the exam board has asked us to do. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.